There's a particular kind of tired that comes from doing something honest and watching people assume it's a mistake before it's even had a chance to prove otherwise. You start to wonder if patience just looks like foolishness to people who never had to wait for anything. But some things only show what they're worth to the one person who refused to stop believing in them. Here's where it begins. The fog was still sitting low over Oakridge County when the first truck pulled up along the fence line. Then another. By 8 o'clock, 6 men stood at the edge of a 4-acre field, hats pushed back, saying nothing, just looking. Behind them, sweet potato vines rolled out in thick green waves, so dense in places the soil had disappeared under the leaves. It was growth that didn't happen by accident, not in a year when half the county's corn had come up thin and stressed, in a summer that couldn't decide whether to drown the fields or scorch them. One of the men finally broke the silence. Wendell Osgood had farmed the next parcel over for 30 years. He was not a man who asked questions he already thought he knew the answer to. Behind him, a couple of the younger farmers shifted their weight, glancing at each other the way men do when they're waiting for somebody else to say the thing out loud first. One of them let out a low whistle at a vine he'd bent back to peer under. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody had laughed in a while, not out here. "What did you put in that soil, Ruth?" She didn't answer right away. She looked out over the field, and for a moment, she wasn't standing in October anymore. She was back in March, walking the same ground when it was still buried under a decade of garbage nobody wanted to claim, wondering if she'd just made the worst decision of her life. Because 7 months earlier, this field hadn't been worth anything to anyone. She bought all 4 acres for $20. Not $20 an acre, $20 total. For ground so choked with old farm waste that the man who sold it to her seemed almost embarrassed to take her money. That's a story that starts long before the sweet potatoes. It starts with a question nobody thought to ask about garbage. Ruth Calloway was 41, and until that spring, most people in Oakridge County knew her as the woman who worked mornings behind the counter at the feed store. She'd grown up 2 counties over, on a small place her grandmother had run mostly alone after Ruth's grandfather passed young. Ruth remembered summers trailing behind the old woman through rows of collards and butter. Beans, memorizing the smell of turned earth at first light, the way her grandmother's hands never seemed to hurry, even when there was more work than daylight. When the land was sold off after her grandmother died, Ruth had nothing to inherit but the habit of paying attention to dirt and a stubborn wish that someday she'd have ground of her own again. For 19 years, she'd carried that wish around like a folded letter in a coat pocket, taken out sometimes, never quite mailed. She didn't have much. A modest savings account, a truck with 140,000 miles on it, and a lot of patience, the kind that gets mistaken for stubbornness by people who've never had to wait for anything. Her grandmother used to say it a different way, standing over that compost pile with a pitchfork she was too proud to replace. Anything ugly enough, left alone long enough, starts looking like something else. She'd never explained what she meant by it. Ruth hadn't understood it then, not really. She was maybe 9 years old, more interested in the beetles the pile turned up than the wisdom underneath it. It was the kind of sentence that waits 20 years in a person before it means anything. So when word went around that Otis Meade wanted to unload a 4-acre parcel he'd used for years as a dumping ground for spoiled hay, old bedding straw, cold produce from a packing shed that had closed down before most people's kids were out of grade school, Ruth didn't laugh the way most people did. She drove out to see it. The field was a mess. Mounds of rotted straw sat in uneven piles along the tree line. Old manure had baked hard under the sun by one fence post. Squash and tomatoes from some forgotten harvest had rotted down into the weeds years back. The ground was lumpy in places, soft and spongy in others. It smelled exactly like what it was. Otis told her flatly he'd stopped even thinking of it as farmland. "It's a clean-up job at this point," he said, kicking at a clump of old straw with his boot. $20 and it's yours, plus whatever headache comes with it. He looked almost sorry to be taking her money at all, folding the bill without counting it, like a man, settling for less than he should out of pure embarrassment. She said yes before she gave herself time to talk herself out of it. Word travels fast in a place this small. Some people thought it was funny. Some thought it was sad. Wendell was blunt about it the first time he saw her out there with a shovel 3 days after the papers were signed. "You didn't buy a farm," he told her, leaning on the fence post between their two properties. "You bought a cleanup job." He wasn't trying to be cruel. He'd farmed this ground his whole life, and he'd seen fields like this before. In his experience, they stayed ruined. He genuinely believed he was doing her a favor by saying so, the way a man tells a neighbor their roof is about to go, expecting thanks and not an argument. At the feed store, where Ruth couldn't avoid the conversation even behind her own counter, a longtime customer named Della Higby set down a bag of chicken feed one Tuesday and just shook her head. "You bought the meat dump lot?" she asked, like she needed to hear Ruth say it out loud to believe it. "I did. Honey, that ground's going to be too sour to grow a weed. You're going to have every rat in 3 townships moved in before Thanksgiving." Della wasn't unkind about it. She patted Ruth's hand on the counter, the way you'd comfort someone who'd just lost money at a yard sale. $20 isn't much to lose. Call it a lesson and walk away before you sink more into it. Ruth rang up the feed and didn't argue. She'd already learned that arguing didn't change anybody's mind out here. Only the field could do that, and the field wasn't ready to say anything yet. She kept going back anyway. Some evenings after her shift, still smelling of feed dust, she'd drive the 2 miles out and just stand at the edge of it, arms crossed, reading the ground the way another woman might read a letter she wasn't sure she wanted to open. Instead of forcing a crop into it right away, Ruth spent the first weeks just walking the property, pulling back the top layers of debris to see what sat underneath. Most of the surface was still recognizably waste. Matted straw, decomposida, the pale skeletons of old vegetables flattened into the ground like something pressed in a book. But dig down past that layer, and something changed. Beneath the newer waste was material that didn't smell the way she expected. It was dark, almost black, crumbly between her fingers. It held together when she squeezed it without turning to mud. She'd seen soil like this exactly once before, in the far corner of her grandmother's garden, where a compost pile had sat undisturbed for years, feeding a stand of butter beans nobody ever had a fuss over. She bought a cheap soil test kit off the shelf she restocked every week at the store and ran it herself some evenings, watching the color strips change under the porch light while the radio murmured low in the next room. The areas where waste had piled up longest had that same loose, dark texture. The fresher debris was still rough, sharp-smelling, more garbage than ground. She marked the field off in her head like a grid, walking it with a notebook she kept in her back pocket, jotting down where the ground gave easy under her boot and where it still fought back. 10 steps from a fence, still rough. 20 steps past that, softer. By the old fence post where the straw had sat the longest, deepest, and darkest of all. The ground gave like something that had been waiting for a hand to press into it. She wasn't a scientist. She didn't pretend to be. But she knew what her grandmother's garden corner had felt like under her fingers, and this felt close enough to trust a little further. It was a matter of time. Years of farm waste, layered and left alone, had slowly turned into something closer to raw compost than trash. That didn't mean the field was ready to plant. Unfinished manure could burn young roots and throw the nitrogen balance off badly. Ruth knew enough from her grandmother's example to be cautious rather than hopeful. But she began to wonder whether the debris everyone assumed had ruined this land might have spent a decade quietly rebuilding it instead. She still didn't know what to plant. Corn worried her, with the drainage so uneven across the 4 acres. Beans, she wasn't confident the nitrogen was there yet, not without. More testing than she had time or money for. She looked hard at squash and cucumbers, crops she half remembered from her grandmother's garden, but kept coming back to something else. Sweet potatoes. They needed loose, well-drained ground with plenty of organic matter, and they could tolerate more imbalance than most row crops. They didn't demand perfect soil. They demanded structure. And structure was exactly what this field seemed to have built on its own, underneath all that mess while nobody was looking. She didn't risk the whole 4 acres. She cleared and prepped less than half of one that spring, working the decomposed material into the topsoil by hand, and with a rented tiller, planting slips in raised rows to help with the drainage problems underneath. The work took 3 full weekends, her back aching in a way that reminded her, not unkindly, of her grandmother's garden. She set each slip at an angle the way an old paperback book at the library had shown her, firmed the soil around it with 2 fingers, and moved on to the next, row after row, until the light gave out each evening. The first weeks were nerve-wracking. Some slips struggled to take root in the rougher patches. One corner of the test plot lagged noticeably behind the rest, leaves curling small and pale. More than one evening, Ruth stood at the edge of that field with the sun going down behind her, wondering if she'd just proven everyone right. Here is what nobody in Oakridge County knew yet, not even Ruth. The hardest test of that soil hadn't come yet. It was still 3 months away, and it would arrive with almost no warning at all. By midsummer, the vines in the test plot were spreading faster than she'd expected. Thick green, crowding out weeds simply by covering the ground. Neighbors driving the county road started slowing down at the fence line. Nobody said much, but people noticed the way people notice a light left on in a house they thought was empty. Then the weather turned. That summer brought one of the driest stretches the county had seen in years. 3 weeks with barely a shower, followed almost without warning by a run of punishing rain that didn't seem to know when to quit. Farms across the area struggled. Corn stunted under the heat, standing shorter than knee-high by the 4th of July. Beans dropped their blossoms before ever setting a pod. Wendell's own fields, worked hard for 3 decades without much organic matter ever going back in, showed the stress everywhere. Cracked ground in the dry spell, wide enough in places to lose a boot heel. Standing water and root rot once the rain finally came, drowning low patches that used to drain fine when he was a younger man. He stood at his own fence line more than once that summer, hat off, just staring at a low corner of his own place going under, the same way Ruth stood at hers. He didn't say much about it to anyone. A man who's farmed the same ground for 30 years doesn't always have the words ready for watching it fail him, especially not in a summer when the neighbor he'd worn off a bad deal was somehow still standing. Ruth's field wasn't immune. She remembered standing at the low corner of the test plot one night in July, rain coming down sideways under a sky the color of a bruise, watching water pool over vines she'd checked that same morning. By the time it drained 2 days later, she'd lost close to 1/5 of the plot. Roots gone soft and dark in her hand when she dug one up to check, the flesh already turning. It was the kind of loss that had her sitting in her truck afterward, engine off, wipers still ticking down from the last swipe, seriously weighing whether to plan a second season at all. She thought about her grandmother's line again that night, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath. Anything ugly enough, left alone long enough, starts looking like something else. It hadn't sounded like a warning back then. Sitting in that truck with mud drying on her boots, it sounded like one now, aimed straight at her own doubt. Maybe the sentence wasn't only about the field. Maybe it never had been. The dry weeks before that had worn on her a different way. She'd run a garden hose out to the field most evenings after a shift, walking the rows by flashlight, checking for the telltale curl of a wilting leaf before it went too far to save. Some nights she didn't get home until well past 10, hands cracked from the hose, and still had to be back at the store by 6. It was not an easy season. It never became one. Della stopped her once at the store during the worst of the dry stretch, studying Ruth's sunburned arms and the dark circles under her eyes with something that had softened just slightly from pity into concern. "You're running yourself ragged over there," she said. "Nobody would think less of you for letting it go." Ruth just thanked her for saying so and rang up the next customer's order because there wasn't a way to explain that letting it go had never once felt like the easier option, not from where she was standing. There's a thing people forget about ground that's been left alone too long, whether it's a field or a life. Nobody trusts it to hold anything because they only ever saw it broken. But soil doesn't know it's supposed to stay ruined. It just keeps doing what soil does quietly, whether anyone's watching or not, season after season, with no interest at all in what anyone predicted for it. What would it take for you to trust something again after everyone had already told you it was finished? Something did become clear as the weeks went on. The dark, organic-rich soil in the healthier sections of Ruth's field held moisture longer through the dry spell, than the hard-packed ground on the farms around her. And it drained faster once the rain hit, instead of sitting there drowning the roots. It wasn't magic. It wasn't some crop shrugging off a brutal season untouched. It was soil that, thanks to years of slowly decomposed organic matter, simply had better structure than the ground around it. Better structure meant more give in both directions, wet or dry. Even in a season that punished nearly everyone in the county without exception. By harvest time, it was obvious the field had done something most people hadn't expected it to do. Ruth's first pull was almost hesitant. She loosened the soil around a single plant with a garden fork, working slow, careful not to nick anything underground. The first sweet potato came up clean and heavy in her hand. Then another. Then a whole cluster of them, tangled beneath the same vine like something hoarded. She moved to the next plant. The yield kept holding. It wasn't a fortune. A few £1,000 off less than half an acre. Sold mostly through word of mouth and a folding table at the end of her driveway, a hand-lettered sign propped against a milk crate. A few $100s in that first modest season. But it was real. The $20 field had produced something worth selling. People stopped who'd never have stopped before. A schoolteacher from town bought a full bushel and asked, almost shy about it, whether Ruth minded telling her how she'd gotten sweet potatoes that clean out of dryland Oakridge dirt. A boy of maybe 10 counted out change from a jar for a single potato the size of his own forearm, and carried it home cradled in both arms like something breakable. Ruth kept the milk crate sign up through the whole of October and never once had to write a new one. What happened next surprised even Ruth. A produce buyer named Frank Doss, who supplied a handful of restaurants over in the next county, stopped by after hearing about her crop from a neighbor 2 farms down. He picked through a crate on her tailgate, turning a few sweet potatoes over in his hands, checking the skins under the light. "These are clean," he said, mostly to himself. "Real uniform, too. You grading these yourself?" "By hand," Ruth said. Twice. He bought everything she had left that week and asked if she'd have more the following season. Then he wrote his number on the back of a business card and handed it over without another word, like he'd already decided something and didn't need to say it out loud. Not long after, a second buyer came around, then a grocer over in town, asking about a standing weekly order come next fall. The grocer, a careful man named Silas Byrne who ran the produce section like it was his own name on the door, walked her folding table twice before he said anything at all. "Consistency's the thing," he told her finally. "I can sell ugly if it's consistent. I can't sell good if it shows up whenever it feels like it." Ruth told him she could give him consistency and meant it, though she drove home that night, doing the arithmetic in her head, wondering exactly how many more rows she'd need to keep a promise like that. Ruth hadn't just grown a good crop. She'd built something buyers wanted to come back for. And that's when the people who'd laughed started showing up at her fence line instead of just driving past it. Wendell was one of the first. He walked the edge of her field, crouched down, and let a handful of the dark soil crumble between his fingers, the same way Ruth had months earlier when nobody was watching her do it. He asked her directly what she'd done differently. No joking in it this time. "You didn't buy fertilizer that expensive on a feed store paycheck," one farmer said, half joking, hat pushed back the way Wendell's had been that first morning. Another guessed she'd had someone from the extension office out to work the ground over for her. A third figured she'd gotten lucky, landed on the one corner of the county that hadn't been ruined by something or other. Ruth told them the truth, and it wasn't the answer most of them expected. It started with the waste. The same rotted hay, old manure, and spoiled produce everyone else had considered worthless had spent years slowly breaking down into something closer to raw compost than garbage. But she was careful to explain what she hadn't done too. She hadn't just left it sitting there and hoped for the best. She'd sorted through it by hand, pulling out what hadn't broken down, tested the soil before she trusted it, chosen a crop that actually suited ground built this way, instead of forcing in whatever everyone else happened to be planting that year. The secret, if there was one, wasn't a trick. It was that waste isn't automatically worthless. Left to properly break down and match to the right crop, material other people were desperate to get rid of could become the foundation of productive ground. Nobody else had looked at that field and seen anything but a mess. Ruth had looked at it and seen years of unfinished work, already half done, just waiting for somebody willing to dig. Word of her results spread faster than her crop did. Within a year, other farmers the same. Ones disposing of old hay, cold vegetables, and spent bedding started asking if she'd take their waste instead of hauling it off themselves. What had once cost the money to get rid of became free raw material for Ruth's growing operation. She built a modest composting setup on part of the original field, sorting and managing incoming material with far more structure than the haphazard dumping that had created her soil in the first place. With pallets for bins, a rotation she kept on a clipboard nailed to the shed wall. She expanded her plantings across more of the 4 acres, added simple root cellar storage to stretch her selling season into the cold months, and slowly reinvested her early profits into better equipment. A proper tiller of her own instead of a rented one. A sturdier root washing setup out behind the shed. Eventually a standing delivery arrangement with 2 grocers in town, her name written into somebody else's ledger every single week. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without mistakes. One early batch of compost, rushed before it had fully matured, burned a section of new plantings and cost her part of the season's yield. A hard lesson in exactly the caution she tried to hold on to from the very beginning, the kind of mistake that stung worse for knowing better. One of the first farmers to bring his own waste over was a quiet man named Purdy Lane, who backed his truck up to her new bins one October morning without much ceremony and started forking out moldy hay he'd been meaning to burn for a month. "Feels strange, paying somebody to take garbage," he said, not quite looking at her. "Used to just be garbage," Ruth told him. "Give it some time." He came back every few weeks after that, and never once asked her to explain herself again. But the business grew steadily, built on the same thing that had gotten her this far. Patience with material other people were in a hurry to throw away. Wendell became one of her regular waste suppliers before the second year was out, hauling his own old hay and manure over to her place instead of dealing with it himself the way he always had. Standing at the edge of her field one afternoon that second autumn, watching the vines roll out thick and healthy across ground that used to make people wrinkle their noses driving past, he admitted something he hadn't expected to say out loud. "I thought you were wasting your money," he said. Ruth just nodded. She wasn't smarter than anyone else in the county. She hadn't found some secret input, some hidden formula nobody else knew about. She'd simply looked at something everyone else had stopped seeing any value in and been willing to wait long enough to find out what it might become. By the second harvest, the county extension office had heard about the field too and sent a young agent out to walk it with a clipboard of his own, asking careful questions Ruth answered as best she could without ever calling herself an expert. She wasn't one, as she said so plainly. She was just a woman who'd paid attention to one 4-acre piece of ground longer and closer than anybody else had bothered to. Della came around too, eventually, buying a bag of Ruth's sweet potatoes off the same folding table she'd once warned her away from, and not saying much about it either way. Some conversations don't need finishing out loud. The bag in her hand said enough. Winter came slow that year, the way it does after a hard harvest, giving everyone time to talk before the ground froze for good. At the feed store, Della started fielding a different kind of question from customers. Ones about whether the mead dump lot really had turned around, and whether Ruth might take on somebody else's spoiled hay come spring. Della answered every one of them the same way now, without a trace of the pity she used to carry into it. "Ask her yourself," she'd say. "She's usually out there past dark." Ruth still thought back, some evenings, to the day she handed Otis Mead a $20 bill for 4 acres nobody else wanted. It hadn't looked like anything at the time. Just garbage. Exactly the kind of gamble a woman with limited savings had no business making, according to everyone who told her so, some of them kindly and some of them not. The field had never been worthless. It had simply been waiting for someone to understand what it could become. And so, in a way, had she. That evening in October, after the trucks had pulled away and the last of the men had gone home with a bag of her sweet potatoes tucked under one arm, Ruth stayed out at the field a while longer. The light was going soft and gold over the tree line, the way it does at the end of a long season, when the shadows stretch out slow instead of falling all at once. She crouched down at the edge of the row nearest the fence, the same spot where she'd first knelt 7 months earlier, not knowing yet what she'd find underneath. The truck engines had long since faded down the county road, and the only sound left was wind moving low through the last of the standing vines. She dug her fingers into the dark soil one more time, the way her grandmother used to, testing it without needing to say out loud what she was testing for. It crumbled, just like it had all along, patient under her hand the whole time nobody believed in it. She didn't say anything to anyone. She didn't need to. She just knelt there a moment longer, dirt under her nails, the field quiet around her in the last of the light, and let herself believe, finally, all the way through, that she'd been right to trust it. Where are you watching this from tonight? And has there ever been a moment, like the one Ruth had standing at that fence line, when you almost let someone else's certainty talk you out of trusting your own two hands? Tell us about it below. We read every single one. See you in the next story.